Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, so have you ever stared down a massive, intimidating project and felt completely drained before you even typed a single word, right? Or maybe you suddenly felt the uncontrollable urge to, I don't know, deep clean your entire kitchen instead. Well, today we're analyzing a really fascinating framework from a paper titled The Physics of Peak Performance. We're going to look at the hard science of why doing the absolute hardest things is actually, scientifically speaking, far easier than we think. Let's jump right into it.
So, is doing hard things actually easy? I know, it sounds like a total paradox. It goes against literally almost everything we've been taught about work and rest. But the source material we're analyzing today suggests our standard approach to difficult, high-stakes tasks, it might just be completely upside down.
Section 1. The Myth of Burnout. Rethinking Caution. The text argues that the psychological barriers of high-stakes tasks are a total myth. Think about that universal dread for a second. We've all been there. Your heart rate ticks up, you feel this heavy weight sitting on your chest, and your brain is desperately searching for an easy distraction. But the research points out that this massive wall we feel like we're hitting, it isn't a physical reality at all. It's entirely a psychological construct.
See, when we face a huge project, our very human instinct is to just dip our toes in the water. We avoid jumping right in, relying on extreme caution, mostly because we fear the whole myth of burnout. We dread the task. But the text actually argues that this very caution is exactly what builds up the friction. We waste so much energy dreading the work, overthinking it, and just tiptoeing around it that we essentially exhaust ourselves before the real work even begins. It's kind of like revving a car engine in neutral, you know? You burn through a ton of gas, but you go absolutely nowhere.
Section 2. The Neurological Gap, Your Brain's Illusion.
This brings us to a massive, measurable gap between how exhausting a task feels and what it actually takes to do it. On one hand, we have perceived effort. That's that heavy, dark cloud of exhaustion you feel just thinking about a project. And then, on the other hand, we have the actual metabolic cost. That's the literal physical energy your brain and body will expend to just sit down and do the work. Your brain is essentially playing a giant trick on you. It's projecting an artificially high perceived effort that simply doesn't match the very manageable metabolic reality.
But here's the best part. We can actually exploit this gap to completely bypass those psychological barriers. Once you fully internalize that the dread is just a neurological illusion, you can step right through that mental block. It is exactly like realizing a terrifying 10-foot-thick brick wall right in front of you is actually just a hologram. No way, right? You don't need to waste time charting a path around it, and you certainly don't need to waste energy trying to climb it. You just walk right through it.
Section 3. Dopamine-Driven Momentum, the catalyst for action.
Now, this brings us to a real game changer. The concept of friction arbitrage. This is the scientific reality that intensity reduces friction faster than caution. Now in finance, arbitrage is taking advantage of a price difference between two markets to make a profit, right? Well here, friction arbitrage is taking advantage of that neurological gap we just talked about. By diving in with intense, focused action rather than slow hesitation, you smooth out the entire process. You quite literally melt the friction away. So how do we actually do this? Mechanically, pulling this off requires a specific sequence. First, you acknowledge the gap. You have to recognize that the dread building up in your chest is just an illusion. Next, you apply intensity. You stop tiptoeing and you dive in headfirst with total focus. And here's the magic. The moment you take that intense action, your brain's reward system kicks in, generating a massive wave of dopamine. Finally, that dopamine-driven momentum acts as a biological lubricant. It reduces the friction, destroys the hesitation, and makes the deep work flow. The hard thing, mechanically and scientifically, becomes so much easier to do.
Section 4. Extreme Output Equilibrium, the New Reality.
Now, the source material makes a truly fascinating claim here. It says, extreme output creates its own sustainable low-resistance equilibrium. And wow, this completely shatters the traditional myth of burnout. We usually assume that extreme output leads to an inevitable fiery crash, right? But when you leverage dopamine and bypass that mental friction, operating at a high intensity becomes a self-sustaining cycle. Because you aren't bleeding metabolic energy on anxiety, procrastination, and avoidance, you can actually sustain massive output quite comfortably.
So let's wrap up with a question. If intensity reduces friction, what is caution actually costing you? Think about your own daily habits and your biggest goals. How much time and energy are you losing right now simply avoiding the deep work? Well, the next time you face a high-stakes task, remember the concept of friction arbitrage. Acknowledge the illusion, ditch the caution, apply the intensity, and just watch those barriers melt away. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and I'll see you next time.